Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcs, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 4, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. We start this new season with a familiar face, author, editor, and lawyer, Gautam Bhatia. It's been a few years since Gautam released The Wall and its sequel, The Horizon. And he's back with a new speculative fiction novel called The Sentence. Set in a distant future during an uneasy peace, The Sentence is equal parts murder mystery, legal drama, political thriller, and ethical conundrum. Don't miss it. Today we discuss the new anthology he's editing for Westland, Indian sci-fi, publishing, reinventing tropes, revolutions, and much more. You can follow Gautam on Twitter at Gautam Bhatia 88. Hi, Gautam. Welcome back to Arcs, and thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for calling me back.
I'm thrilled to see you, and, well, for our listeners, thrilled to hear you. A lot has happened since you published The Horizon, which is when we last spoke.
Now, almost 3.5 years ago.
Yeah, wow. And you've written, by the way, 3 books in that time. So congratulations on being horribly productive. I mean, you put us all to shame. So for people who aren't in the know, Gautam is a very well-known lawyer and scholar, as well as a speculative fiction writer, which is the kind of multiple talent nonsense that the rest of us can't handle. And now I understand you're editing a sci-fi anthology for Westland. Could you tell us a bit about it?
So last year, Westland began a dedicated imprint to speculative fiction called If, which is the first such imprint among Indian publishers in the English language. And this is something that's great because those of us who write and I think also read spec fic in India are aware that there are large parts of the infrastructure that exists in other countries which makes speculative fiction as a genre prominent, which don't exist in India. So conventions, a community of critics, magazines, and imprints. So this is the first such imprint, which is good. So one of the initiatives that they've taken is to have an anthology of Indian speculative fiction coming out later this year. I'm editing it along with the Westland's in-house editorial team. And there are 2 things that we are doing in this anthology, which are a little different from the way anthologies normally work, both in the genre as well as broadly in the literary space. One is that it is completely by open call. So there is not a single solicited piece in the anthology. There will be 10 short stories and 1 novelette at the end, and each of them have come via an open call process. So we didn't invite anyone. There was nobody who just had like a pass into the anthology. And the second, and I think more innovative thing is we did it double-blind peer review, as happens in academia, which is to say that I, who was doing the first round of selections, I did not know the identity of the authors. So the idea was that so much of genre fiction, especially the anthology space, completely works on, I have gotten this contract to edit this anthology. Let me ask my friends who also happen to be in common WhatsApp groups and we hang out, in the same convention. Then we ask them to contribute, and then we'll get this book of stories out published by this publishing house, which I think is really gatekeeping at a particularly indefensible level. So we wanted to start off something different, and so we took this route. And we got 233 submissions, which I shortlisted to 30 short stories and 6 novelettes. And we finally narrowed it down to 10 and 1, which will be the TOC. And of course, this is a paid market. So we pay 12,500 rupees per short story and 25,000 rupees for a novelette. So we're trying to make that as fair as we can, given financial constraints. It was fun. And hopefully we will do this every year. So there will be an annual If anthology of Indian spec fic, which will follow the same process.
I'm so happy to hear that. And thank you for sharing the financial details as well, because that's something that I feel like a lot of people, they kind of talk around it and not about it. It's encouraging to know that there is transparency at that level.
Yeah, all of this was upfront in the submissions call. Now, we wish that we could offer more. We could sort of match the Science Fiction Writers Association's professional pay rates, which are basically 8 cents per word. But we don't have American money. So this is what we could do. And again, hopefully we can make it better as we go along.
I mean, that's the hope generally, I think,
Yeah.
for the Indian publishing industry.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of what you said is very familiar to me. The idea
Yeah.
of commissioning from your friends and
Yeah.
hiring among your friends. It's a very common problem that a lot of people have come up against in the industry.
Yeah, and it's something that is a big problem, not just in India, but across the world for speculative fiction, because you end up seeing anthologies come out and you're like, I never heard of this. And how is it that I'm only hearing of this when it's now being published? I know all these names. I mean, clearly someone reached out to them, right? So this is something that I think annoys many people about how opaque it is and how cliquish it is. The idea was to try and set an example that, look, it doesn't have to be cliquish in this way. Now, of course, one problem which will remain is that you can double blind peer review all you want, but if someone's been to a writing workshop, if someone has access to beta readers who will give them feedback, if someone has done this before, there will be a difference and you will notice it off the bat. So from the first page on, you can tell if something is polished and has been written by somebody who is in a certain sense a pro and someone who's not, and that's just visible from the first page. You can't erase or eradicate, I think, the biases beyond a point, but you can try and mitigate them to the extent possible, which is the goal that we set out to do with the anthology.
Well, I'm glad to hear there are some new voices because I think that's kind of the challenge, I think, for people who are unknowns and who maybe aren't in those circles and don't have access to those spaces. It's encouraging to think that at some point they're getting a leg up and they will hopefully be giving a leg up to other people. That's a good thing. That's a really nice start to this, hopefully, legacy thing.
Hopefully.
Also, I wanted to talk to you about the Indian sci-fi scene because it's been a while since you published a sci-fi book. Or could we call The Wall and Horizon sci-fi? I suppose so.
Speculative at the intersection of science fiction and fantasy. Some reviews have called it fantasy and some science fiction. So yeah, it's at a borderline. Yeah,
borderline is right. I enjoyed that about it, really. It felt a little genre moving, if you will.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how you feel the Indian sci-fi scene has developed in these last few years. And I feel like there are a lot of new writers emerging and the landscape looks different. And I do feel like Indian sci-fi writers are getting their flowers finally on the international scene as well.
I think yes and no. So in my newsletter at the end of last year, I made a list of the Indian book length spec fic published over the year. And my criterion was basically, Indian passport, right? Just to make it easier and avoid all these debates about diaspora, non-diaspora. I think it's a fruitless debate beyond a point. And there were 9 books that were published. I think the previous record was 3. And that was the year The Wall came out. I think that year was also Chosen Spirits and Analog Virtual. So I think it was, in that sense, like a massive, increase. People like Kannan Gill, right, whom you wouldn't associate with writing spec fic novel, and a serious one. It wasn't a comedian moonlighting, it was a serious science fiction novel, right, and others as well. So I think that's good. Something like the If anthology is good. Now, obviously, you have recognition as well. So Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan obviously was a Clark Award finalist, is published abroad. Darshan is being published by DAW. Samit, of course, was published by Tor. So all of that has happened over the last 3 or 4 years. Prashant Srivatsa, obviously published by Harper Voyager, Spicegate. And Amal Singh and Aditya Sudarshan, both published by Flame Tree Press. So I think in that sense, Indian writers being published abroad and of course being nominated for awards, I think the problem though remains that it is top heavy, right? I think it's a bit misleading to say Indian SF in English has come of age because we had a Clark Award finalist this year. I don't think that is what we should be looking at. It's of course great and it's wonderful, but just look at what Chinese science fiction has done over the last 10 years, right? It's not Cixin Liu, three-body problem. It is so much deeper. There is a whole culture of Chinese science fiction writing. I don't think we have that yet. I think what we still have is a set of isolated writers, relatively isolated, who are doing their own thing, some of whom are striking it in big, and of course there's a lot of luck involved in that. Right place, right time. But I don't think like Indian SF as in English as an identity is yet really formed. So I think the answer is yes and no. In some ways, there has been progress, but in some ways, I think many of the issues that we had when we last spoke continue to be issues with respect to Indian speculative writing in English.
Oh, no, I totally agree with you that there's a long way to go because I had the same thought, the idea that there were 3 books the year that you came out with, I think The Horizon or The Wall.
Yeah.
And now, as you said, 9. I also do think that there is a kind of influx of people interested, which is something that I find is a shift in the culture. Because when I first started talking about sci-fi and saying I wanted to read it, it felt very inaccessible because a lot of that was available to us was written by old white men.
Yeah.
And a lot of my friends were like, that's not for me. And now I am always thrilled and excited when I walk into a bookstore and I see Lavanya's book or Prashant's book up front because I'm just like, yes,
Yeah.
finally, it's not just J.K. Rowling or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, I feel like there is a little bit of a shift in the readership, maybe.
Yeah.
And that's encouraging. I hope it continues. I'm excited about anything that's not a self help book.
Yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely been progress, undeniable. I think the concern is more, it shouldn't just be top heavy progress. We shouldn't replicate the thing where we have like 2 or 3 stars, right? And then like blank, 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 right? So to have like breadth, have depth and not just some superstars who then sort of almost become representative. And I think that's the issues over there with how that works.
No, I can appreciate that. And I'm glad also that this anthology is giving space to people who might not otherwise get through that first round of publishing
Yeah.
gatekeeping, right? I'm really hopeful that there'll be people who are publishing your anthology who will come out with more books and more things like that.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And we just discussed how there are so few people. But what do you think are the gaps right now in terms of storytelling? What do you think people haven't really explored in the Indian sci-fi landscape?
The kind of science fiction that I am attracted to has always been the galaxy spanning, awe inspiring time and space explorations. Ian M. Banks, Alistair Reynolds, Adrian Tchaikovsky. That's really been my jam. And I don't think we've seen that yet. And I think there's a good reason for that. It's because it won't get published. It won't get published in India for obvious reasons. But also, when you look at the kinds of stuff that Western agents were the first round of gatekeeping, and then publishers want from Indians, it is something that is recognizably Indian to a non-Indian audience, right? So they want to see it as what they think of as being Indian. For Strange Horizons, 3 or 4 years ago, we did a Palestinian special issue, and it was, of course, edited by Palestinian writers. And one of them wrote in the introductory piece that, like, I don't want to see a Palestinian writing about Palestine. I want to see a Palestinian writing about, like, Deep Space Nine, right? And that's what doesn't happen because that is still the preserve of the white people, right? They get to write about these universal themes of, like, grand space operas, whereas we do, like, some colonial, decolonial stuff that in some way fits an image of India. I think that's the big gap, which I think will take some time to address. I think what you need actually is that one breakout novel like Three Body Problem that shows that, look, yeah, Indian science fiction can be like an Ian M. Banks style culture series or a Reynolds style 6 million years spanning the galaxy. Like, it can be stuff we do. Of course, anchored in our own context. That's obviously there. I think that is one big gap. But I think otherwise, yeah, it's pretty diverse. So if you look at those 9 books from last year, from the anthology of anti-caste SF to Sudarshan's Idolatry, which is near future Bombay with religion playing a big role, so near future dystopia, to Lavanya's Interstellar Mega Chef, so cooking and cooking's role in broadly like a space opera context, to Prashant's Spice Gates. Yeah, so I think it's a great range of stuff. But what I would like to see is that space opera that is in no way identifiable as being something Indian, but is just, a space opera.
So what I'm hearing is you don't want to see the Mahabharata set in a galaxy.
I do not want to see the Mahabharata set in I do not. Not the Mahabharata, not the Ramayana, Not the Indian freedom movement, just the space opera. Yeah.
Okay, now we will come to the fun portion of the interview, which is I get to ask you questions about the sentence.
Yeah.
And before we jump in, I'd like to invite you to tell us a bit about the book.
So the sentence, when I normally begin writing, I have an image in my head and I know how it ends. And the rest of the process is getting from the image to the ending. And the image this time was of a man frozen in time in a cryogenic chamber. It is one of the oldest tropes in the genre, which is frequently used in terms of long-distance space travel, because those science fiction writers who want to have long-distance space travel while adhering to the broad laws of physics, which would mean your travel remains approaching light speed but doesn't go beyond that, would require journeys that take many, many years, many generations, in fact. And so what do? You preserve people in a cryo chamber and then they wake up at the end of the journey. That is the role it plays. It's a very common trope. For me, given my day job, I was intrigued about was whether this could actually become a form of legally mandated punishment, something that would replace the death penalty. Because in my engagement with capital punishment, the one big thing is that death penalty is unlike any other kind of punishment because it is the only factually irreversible punishment. So whereas in anything else, if you make a mistake, if you imprison someone, you can let them out, you can compensate them. Of course, you can't give them back lost time, but in some ways you can try and set them back on their lives and make up for your mistake. If you execute someone and you find you've made a mistake, there's no way of bringing them back. So your mistakes are permanent. And of course, the question is that we are a fallible species. Can we assume the infallibility that comes with administering capital punishment? And then with the science fiction, then you ask, well, what if we could, right? What if we had reversible death penalty? And so that became the premise, where the society, the city of Peruma, has invented a cryogenic preservation, and they choose to use it as the substitute for death penalty. And they say, look, if you commit a very, very serious crime, in this book, it is the assassination of the city's ruler, which plunges the city into a very bloody civil war. The alleged assassin then is given this sentence. And if it comes out over the next 100 years that he is innocent, then he can be revived and live again. If 100 years pass by, the assumption is that, okay, look, it didn't happen for so long, it's not going to happen, pretty much guaranteed. And given the body will eventually break down, that's around the time when science says this is basically it. So then you unplug the cryo chamber and the person dies. The story is set 1 week from 100 years to this assassin's time running out. And it is also a week in which the post-Civil War status quo is being disrupted. The city's two halves are almost in conflict. Added to that mix is the possibility that this person might be innocent and may be revived now and come back into this cauldron that's there. That's how the story begins and unfolds from there.
Thank you for that lovely summary. Before we kind of get into it, I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed this sentence. I don't know what I was expecting when I read it, but it really does feel like a natural progression for you because you're wonderful at pacing and suspense. And so I feel like sci-fi and political whodunit seems very much in your purview. So congratulations, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I want to ask you about the world building. Your stories are very intertwined with the settings. I found that in The Wall and The Horizon as well. The cities that you create are kind of a character in the story as well. Could you tell us a bit about that? Why do you choose to do that?
So I've always been fascinated by urban design, urban architecture, and just how deeply architecture and the city design is intertwined with politics and just the class divisions in a city. And there is a lot of scholarship and writing on that. There is a fantastic book called Building Without Authority, which looks at various kinds of anarchist architecture in various parts of the world and just examines how through designing a city in a particular way, you can move towards more access, more equality, or wall off spaces have or entrench hierarchies. So in part, I paid a lot of attention to just the way the city is built to suggest the kind of political structures that are presently there under contest, in conflict, and so on. So that's the way I do the world building.
That's so fascinating. Actually, the next question I was going to ask you is about architecture because I felt like it did play a very large role in the book. And I really loved the descriptions of this city divided by the river, which was obviously a very visual description. I could just picture it. And also the idea that both these factions, which is the commune and Hightown, have chosen completely different architecture. I was just curious how you came up with those specific kind of architecture.
Yeah, so the city is in two halves, which followed the Civil War or the Revolution, depending on which side you come from. The northern part is Hightown, which used to be where the governance happened and where the corporations had their headquarters and where the aristocrats live. The southern part used to be where the workers were living, and they were all basically living in a heavily surveilled, grid, ghetto-ish kind of a city. After the revolution, they became an autonomous commune. The northern part is basically downtown Tokyo, right? Towers of iron and steel and glass with manicured water and lawns that break it up, but manicured, right? If you ever walk down downtown Tokyo, you'd know just how it looks like. And it suggests this will to control your urban space and to have symmetry, to have a certain kind of order within which people can then live. The southern part is the commune, which is an anarchist body. And so the question was, how would anarchists organize themselves in urban spaces? I'm not the first to ask the question in genre. Le Guin's Dispossessed. Actually, there's a lot that goes on in architecture over there, which she just slips in a line here, a line there, but she really focuses a lot on the architecture. I was inspired a lot by this little neighborhood in Paris, south of Paris, called Ivry, where they tried to put this into practice, where they built this crazy architecture, completely chaotic, but with a pattern, but pattern and chaos, where inside, outside blur. And the idea behind it was to try and, first of all, break down this very capitalistic notion of the public and the private in a certain way to prompt encounters between people that are not necessarily planned for, and so on. So a large part of the fluidity of the commune in the novel is actually based on my visits to that neighborhood where they tried to put into practice.
I love that. And I mean, if I'm ever in Paris again, I will go seek that out. That sounds wonderful. There are two main factions in this city, and the commune, formerly known as Lowtown, and Hightown, which has retained its name, very pretentious name. Could you tell us a bit more about them? You mentioned one were anarchists, and the other, from the name, you can tell are the ones who are still kind of holding the political power.
Yeah, so this city basically has a long history, and there's a timeline that I give in the beginning of the book. And it's basically been a city of industrial conflict. It arose out of the ruins of a former empire. It then became a sort of city-state, and it was always driven by industrial conflict around a mineral called Mandalia, which is mined on the northern part of the city. And so obviously there was this strong working class movement, which was always in conflict with the industrialists, the capitalists, and the rulers. There were multiple uprisings. This sort of historically traces the attempts of Baron Haussmann in Paris to ensure after the Paris Commune there could not be a revolution by basically broadening the roads and making sure you couldn't have barricades and so on. So a similar thing, but they just pushed all the workers beyond the river so that they could surveil them and have this grid city. But money ran out, and so they weren't able to do that. And so what then happened was that underground movements began to spring up, and finally it led to this revolution, which was triggered by this assassination of the then director of the city called Purul. Then there was a civil war, and there was fighting, and finally there was a stalemate. And then both sides had to come to the table, negotiate, and sign this Charter of Peace and Unity, which is again borrowed from many real-life treaties of similar names. And so the north side became Hightown. It was the remnants of the old ruling class. The south side was now an autonomous commune that was self-governing. They would both enter into negotiations about individual works contracts and revenue sharing and so on. So now what you have when the story begins is two antagonistic, very different, very opposite halves of one city, which are held together in a very uneasy and fragile peace, which is about to run out. So that's when the story begins.
So I felt like you indulged your inner legal scholar very much with this book, and I really enjoyed that. It feels very focused on the law itself and the ethics of lawmaking and the struggles of it, really, because one of the central plots is essentially focused around their version of the Constitution, I would say, this treaty or whatever is governing this very different factions in society. And the other is a murder mystery of sorts. All roads are leading to one particular revelation, but on the surface, these are two different legal cases. So why did you choose these two things?
So the murder mystery, of course, flows from the central premise of the book, which is the death penalty, right? The individual who was sentenced on the ground that he assassinated the leader of the city. And now the only way to get him off 100 years later is to prove that he didn't do it. Of course, if he didn't do it, then who did? Right? And so you end up entering into the domain of a murder mystery. The kind of murder mystery I prefer actually is the Higashino Japanese type murder mystery, where it's not so much about who did it. In fact, the interesting thing about the Higashino style is that pretty much 2/3 of the way through, you figure out who did it, and you're very happy with yourself, you're very smug. Yeah, I've cracked the case. And that's the point, because actually the story is never about who, it's about the why and the how. And so you're very happy thinking, oh, I've solved the case. And then he hits you with the why and the how, which completely overshadows the who. It doesn't matter anymore. The who just stops mattering after a point. And then you get this like massive disorientation when the how and the why come out. And that leads you into the deeper recesses of the human soul and the psychology and so on. So I think that's really interesting. So I tried to follow something similar where actually more than one person has said, we figured out what was going on, but then that's not the point. And there's something else going on that's the actual point. So that kind of a murder mystery was what I was going for. And of course, the larger issue around, the ethics of death penalty and so on then became a big point. And the second thing, like you said, was the concept constitutional sort of a dispute. And here, both parties agree to this charter that they would try to freeze things for 100 years. They say, okay, we will not amend or change anything in this charter for 100 years so that we can learn to live in peace, and then we will renegotiate our relationship. Of course, it doesn't quite work that way because it's very difficult to establish peace without first answering your fundamental questions of justice. Something that informs this plot idea is many historical events where society is emerging from very violent civil wars, revolutions, coups, and so on. They say, okay, look, we have to move on. We have to forget the past. The only way of doing that is by burying the past. So nobody can question what happened. Nobody question who did what atrocities were committed. We will draw a line and just move onwards. It doesn't work that way. So for example, in this book, in this novel, I refer to something called the Pact of Forgetting. That's actually a real thing. So in Spain, after Franco died and Spain became a democracy, they actually had something called the law of forgetting, which literally was that nobody will question the atrocities committed during Franco's regime by his coterie of army generals and so on. Because you would do that, you would be always stuck in a civil war. So we will just move past the past, right? Through the mechanism of this treaty or constitution or this founding legal document that legally forces you to forget. And so what happens when society is forced to forget, right? So that was the question I was curious about.
And it's so interesting because you've set it 100 years in the future, and you're so aware that even 100 years later, the questions remain. I mean, obviously, some things have been forgotten, but it's also so easy to make people folk heroes, which is something that we see in the book. And part of that is the power of a larger than life figure, and how if you topple that off a pedestal, what happens.
Yeah.
And I found that very interesting as well, because that's something that I think quite regularly we see among our more regular political figures in any part of the world, really, is that you keep thinking you're voting for someone, or you're hoping you're voting for someone great, and then they obviously shove themselves off a pedestal quite violently. But coming back to cryogenic preservation, because that is something that I was very interested in. As you said, it is very old school sci-fi. It really did give me Star Trek vibes, and I was like, oh, wow, okay, I didn't expect that. But at the same time, when I thought about it, I had a lot of conflicted thoughts. And I think you've gone into that really nicely in the book, where the protagonist, Nila or Nila? How do you pronounce it? Nila is, she and her friend are discussing it, and they're like, even if these people get off, they're still stranded 60 or 40 years in the future. And then they kind of see what happens to these people, and it's not always good.
Yeah.
It is a kind of prolonged agony in a way. This is, in my opinion, just a kind of prolonged death penalty.
Yeah.
Why was that so important to explore for you?
Because, as I said a little earlier, when we have our actual debates about death penalty, the one thing that people say is that, look, what distinguishes death penalty from other forms of punishment is the irreversibility, right? But there are other reasons why death penalty should not be there, which have nothing to do with permanence or irreversibility. And so I think with science fiction, of course, the great thing is you change that one thing and then you ask, what if, right? And so part of the thing was to explore, what if they actually were to say that we can now reverse things? Would that make it okay? Maybe not, because if someone was to be revived 40 years after they had been sentenced, they would literally come into a world where it is still recognizable, but all your close relations are basically either dead or much older. How do you adapt to that world? And this is not just science fiction, because actually you have these stories from the US where someone who was imprisoned in 1980 is now released on a miscarriage of justice. He went into jail before the internet, before laptops, before phones, before mobile phones. And he's coming out to that world. Right? Like, how do you adapt to that kind of a world? And that, I think, goes into the heart of the underlying cruelty of any carceral system. So I think I was interested in exploring that. It doesn't matter if you say, okay, death is now no longer a concern. There's still something that is very violent and cruel about carceral justice and any system that relies on taking people out of society and isolating them as a kind of punishment or penance.
Absolutely. I think that's very true. And this kind of circumstance is something that I think about a lot. Nila, the protagonist, is a guardian, which I would say is equivalent of being a lawyer.
It's a very stylized version of the ideal set of lawyers, basically.
Yeah, someone who is trained to be very objective in the sense that they're supposed to disown the community that they're from. They're supposed to live this kind of neutral life. And in fact, even when they're put on cases, they kind of mix the teams up. So there's some people from Hightown, some people from Commune. So was that a bit of a self-insert?
No, it wasn't a self-insert in the sense that none of the characters resemble me or anybody I know. I think that's a disaster for writing a good novel. It's terrible. So not in that way, but it does explore, I think, many of the myths that surround the legal profession, not necessarily in India, but in society. The task of the lawyer in society, which is to basically advocate for a particular case without being a part of the cause or what the case is about. And on that very unstable distinction is the entire practice of law built. And I want to just poke and question a bit about that.
Something else that I thought was almost a character in the book was the idea of revolution. In the timeline that you mentioned earlier, it tells us of various worker revolts that were put down and then the rise of this more anarchist faction.
Yeah.
And it's all very French Revolution if the aristocrats were allowed to keep their heads and their high rises.
Yeah.
I was really interested in Nila, who is from the commune, but decides to leave that behind and now is having a little bit of an identity crisis in that she sees the flaws in the system that she grew up in, or rather lack of system since they're anarchists. But she also does see the rather huge flaws in Hightown. And the motto, which is quite intense, is let justice be done though the world burn. And that's a statement that gets her into a lot of trouble in one way or another. But I found it an interesting perspective for someone who is in the legal field. Can you tell me a bit about that? Like, why did you shape her that way?
So, of course, at a very basic level, we all come from a context, and it's very difficult to extricate ourselves from that context. Either we are immersed in it or we are rebelling against it. So, a lot of that was just trying to understand that, yeah, I mean, if you did have a successful revolutionary movement that was able to establish itself and actually succeed, unlike the Paris Commune that was crushed in 3 months' time, it would then give rise to its own discontents, which would obviously be exemplified in young people, right? It's always been the case. And much like Le Guin's dispossessed, right? Even though you have this equal society, that creates its own resentments, its own kind of rebellions. So you've got this anarchist commune and you have managed to put into place the principles of living a revolutionary, equal, free life. And still, of course, people will rebel, right? And so there is that tension over there. But as far as Nila's motto goes, she picks this motto for herself as a guardian, which is let justice be done though the world burns, which for her effectively means that for me, it's not about what the consequences of my actions might be. My only job is to ensure that justice under law be done. The cause is not of my concern. I just have to represent the person I'm representing to the best of my ability. And likewise, the judge's role then is to apply the law to the facts and decide the case. Doesn't matter what might follow. As opposed to a point of view that is much more attuned to the possible consequences and would actually say you cannot have justice without thinking of the consequences, right? In this book, that dilemma comes through. If you're going to bring back this figure of Jagat, the assassin, right, or the martyr, this really polarizing, really controversial figure who is loved by one side and despised by the other, in a context where they've managed to get a very fragile peace and they've managed to actually move past it, are you going to just reopen a very, very troubled history and then risk further conflict? And that's why when Nila is being dissuaded from continuing with the case, what she is told by the present leader, director of the city, is that there may be a time, guardian, when it doesn't matter whether our peace is founded on the truth or a lie. All that matters is that there is peace, right? And so he's saying, look, even if there was a wrongful conviction 100 years ago, even if we made a mistake, some mistakes are better just left being mistakes. And if you try and correct history, then you're letting yourself in for a lot of trouble, right? So at some point, justice has to stop and you must have peace, you must have stability.
I really enjoyed that aspect of it because I do think that you can empathize with both sides of that equation.
Yeah.
From the perspective of looking at the larger picture, which we're all encouraged to do because, we live in a country which is obviously very deeply in the shades of gray. And we're always encouraged to think of the bigger picture as if that absolves smaller wrongs. I mean, I say smaller in air quotes, but yeah. And at the same time, I do think that she is very naive, but also that revolutions are built on that kind of naive. You need that kind of ideological fervor to start a revolution. Does she evolve a lot during the course of the book? Because I do feel she changes, but I'm not necessarily sure how.
Yeah, I think she begins by being very sure about herself and her convictions. And this idea of let justice be done though the world burns. She's dead certain that this is the right thing to do, and her job is to do the right thing. And throughout the novel, that's chipped away at, right? Many people come and chip away at it, events chip away at it, circumstances chip away at it. Here's a person who goes from being sure to learning to doubt in a generative kind of a way. So I think that's the arc that is there for her across the story.
It's kind of interesting to watch her as someone who's so principled in some things, and in others, you can kind of see that falling off as the novel progresses, right?
Yeah,
Because
you make compromises. You realize, yeah.
Just the fact that she doesn't really have any kind of institutional support, and
Yeah.
in fact, she figures out that the institution is actively working against her. It is an interesting place to be, because I don't think it occurred to her that when she said "let the world burn," that she could be a part of it.
Yeah.
And I found that a very fascinating kind of character development as she moves forward, because she becomes more aware of what she has to lose when she thought she didn't have anything much to give.
Yeah.
And without giving too much away, she discovers that there's a lot of political maneuvering happening behind the scenes that she's not aware of, and that has actually been driving the whole situation.
Yeah.
And then she has a moment where she realizes what is really at stake.
Yeah.
Which is a terrifying moment, really.
Yeah.
And she chooses an unorthodox solution. I won't give away what it is, because obviously that would give away the very exciting ending of the book. But were you thinking of it as a hero's journey, or did you want to subvert that? What was your thought process?
No, it wasn't a hero's journey at all. It was much more a human journey, just with all the obstacles and barriers, and just often you think you know where you stand and what the right thing is, and then you find you don't. So I think it was more about how confused we all are in these contexts and how easy it is to get played, right? The more arrogant we are, the more likely we are getting played. It was more a human fallibility story than any kind of hero's arc.
Before I wrap up, I also wanted to ask you about the period in which you set this book, because you mentioned that they've existed in a sort of uneasy peace for the last century.
Yeah.
But they've entered into this last leg of this mandated peace, and it's a kind of social and politically conflicted time. So why choose this time as opposed to that uneasy peace? Were you aiming to explore that conflict, or?
Yeah. I mean, it was basically what happens when the peace runs out, right? And at the moment, and that's when the stakes rise, and that's when choices have to be made. So you've managed to have your peace for 100 years, and this is the week when it's going to come to a head, because this is the week that charter is running out. This is the week when your most famous martyr might be resurrected, and this is when everybody now faces those existential choices, right? Which makes for interesting writing. Right? So it was more that than any other reason.
I was just wondering, imagine she stumbled onto this case at a time where things were going good,
Yeah, you just have a less interesting story at that point.
I was just thinking it might have also been like running up against a brick wall, because nobody would have been interested in her or anything.
Yeah.
Right?
The emergency focuses your mind a lot more than normalcy.
Yeah. And also you've picked a very particular time period for it.
She has 1 week to solve the mystery,
I always love that kind of thing, because it adds a sense of urgency to the plot. But I did start thinking of this very much like a murder mystery novel till the very end. And then I was like, damn it, Gautam.
I still think it is, but it is a murder mystery in the Japanese tradition and not in your Agatha Christie, where the whole genius is in who, right? This is more the Japanese kind of shock.
So you left us without a small Belgian man twirling his mustache.
Yeah.
And you did leave this book on a cliffhanger of sorts.
Yeah.
And are you planning to return to this world?
I am, yes. I wasn't intending to. Much like The Wall on the Horizon, even though the horizon ends on not a cliffhanger, but it is open. There is space to write more. But I thought I was finished with that story, and I thought that the sentence would be standalone, and I'm done with this because I want to get to that space opera I've been talking about for a long time. But what happened was that I signed with a literary agent in the UK in mid-Jan, John Baker at Bell Lomax Morton, and he was very keen for there to be a book too, because he said that, look, this interface of law and science fiction is something that is very unique and no one else is really doing it in this way. So why don't you think of something else in the same universe? And actually it turned out, the more I thought of it, the more I thought this actually would be a very good thing to set 12 years after the events of the sentence, where Nila is now in her mid-30s and is a very different person. And then again is faced with an existential kind of a problem in a different city. So I wrote a pitch for it, and it's presently on submission. The literary agent has submitted the manuscript along with the pitch for a second book. And he has said that some publishers are not fully comfortable with a sequel, so it may have to be same universe but different characters. An older Nila with now a lot more experience would be, I think, interesting. So either that or same universe, like same continent, same set of things, but maybe 100 years later, like new cast of characters. But you will see more of this coming in the future. I'm aiming to write it over the course of this year and hopefully finish it by the end of the year, at least the first draft. And then we'll see if it goes anywhere. But my dream now is to actually do this 12 years later story.
I would be very excited to read the 12 years later because Nila in her 30s is going to be a very, very different person.
Yeah.
Okay, so my fingers are crossed and I'm really hoping you get to write that. I am thrilled that you're going to be playing in the same playground again. I love that idea.
It'll be the same kind of law meets science fiction, legal debates around not death penalty, other issues around crime punishment. That'll be similar.
I mean, I'm still holding out for the third book in the Wall Horizon.
If someone ever agrees for a deal, then sure. That's going to be a long wait. Yeah.
You heard it here first. We need the third book. Subtle pressure for the publishing industry. So anyway, before I sign off, I have one last question, which is, are you working on anything currently that you want to shout out? Do you have anything in the pipeline?
Just this one. So that's what I'm working on. Of course, the anthology is coming out later this year, but that's pretty much it. Yeah, these two things.
I'm hesitant to believe you because I'm pretty sure that you will come out with 2 other books in the next 2 years.
I mean, there is nonfiction, but that's not genre. Yeah.
I like that. You're like, actually, I'm just going to say I am writing nonfiction also. Disgustingly productive. Anyway, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Gautam. It's always such a pleasure, and congratulations on the sentence, and my fingers are crossed for the next book. I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Arcs is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and notes.